But neither one of us are your special guest today. We also have Deborah with us, and she is an author and just published her very first book. But the funny thing is, on the book, it doesn't say Deborah. So I'm going to let her tell you about that a little bit as well. So I think you're going to talk for a few minutes.
I am.
And then we can have some questions if you boys and girls are interested. Sound good?
Absolutely. Let's give a round of applause for Deborah.
Hi guys. Well, as you can see, I'm going to bring out some props. And this is a dragon. And this is my first book that I published. And it's called The Keepers of Éire. And it's all about dragons and people who ride the dragons. And it's set in modern day Ireland. Now this book is actually for adults. And the reason that I wrote it for adults is because I really like dragons. And there's not a lot of books for adults to read about dragons. So I wanted to tell a story that adults would like about dragons. But one of the things about books is, books encourage you to use your imagination. If I hadn't have been reading as a young person, your age, I wouldn't have been able to build up my imagination to be able to write this book. One of my favorite books that I read when I was maybe 5 or 6, Where the Wild Things Are. Have you guys read this book?
Yeah.
And the movie, now there's a movie out about
Of course.
it, that's right. A lot of movies come from books. This book talks a lot about Max and how he uses his imagination to go into a different world. And that's what I like to do when I read and write about other things. I like to write about dragons because I've been fascinated with dragons since I was maybe your age, maybe a year or two younger than you. And my mom gave me some dragons when I was little, and so I started collecting dragons. Some of the dragons that I collected, well, this dragon right here, he's a puppet. So he talks and he moves around a little bit. Another couple of dragons that I've collected. It's a nice small little dragon here. These dragons have wings, but there are other dragons out there that don't have wings. The dragons in my story have wings because they fly and they protect Ireland. Here's another dragon, and he comes out of a shell. Dragons come out of shells. They don't come out of their mommies full-born like you do. So I'm going to let you guys pass these around.
Thank you.
You guys can look at those, okay? Now, one of the things that I always want to talk about is, I know you guys know what the different types of books are. There's books that are called fiction books, and those are books that are make-believe, and that's what I wrote. It's a make-believe book. There's also books that are called nonfiction, and they tell you the truth. Some of those are about people's lives. Some of them are about things that happened in history. And today, 50 years ago today, there was the President of the United States. Do you guys remember hearing about this or reading about this, where President John F. Kennedy was assassinated? That happened 50 years ago today. So there's lots of books written about that, and they're called nonfiction books because they tell the truth of what happens. Now in stories, in books, there's always a beginning, a middle, and an end in the story. And two of the main things that you need to have in a story are your characters, and your characters have to have a goal. Otherwise, it'd be just like a boring day. If you were to come into school and you always had a peanut butter sandwich and an apple and a carton of milk, every day, that'd be pretty boring, right?
Actually, that's what Jake has every day.
No, that was last year.
Oh, that was last year, sorry, thank you.
Second grade.
But what happens if, say, a frog jumped out of its aquarium and gobbled up Jake's sandwich? That would be a special day. And maybe the frog jumped out and he jumped out of the window or out of the door, and you were afraid that he would get run over or stompled when kids are outside playing. So your job as a character would be to go and save that frog and go and grab that frog and put him back in his aquarium to save him. So that's you would be the character in that story. Your frog would be a character in that story. but the plot would be all the ways that you would have to get a hold of the frog and get him back in his aquarium. And that's basically what a story's all about, is telling your readers about your characters and about the plot or the things that happen that make it not so ordinary day, okay? Now, everyone says if you're gonna write a book, you wanna write a book about things that interest you or things that you know about. And you know why? Anybody know why? Okay.
Probably because no one wants to read a book that's really boring.
That's one thing. Anybody else?
Because it interests you, it's from your heart.
That's right, it's from your heart. And one of the reasons that you want to write something that's from your heart is because usually it takes a lot of research for you to learn about the things that you're writing about. Because even though my book is about dragons, and dragons aren't really real, except maybe the Loch Ness Monster, but I had to
Bigfoot.
write the book to make sure that people knew that if dragons did exist, I was telling the story correctly. Okay? So what I did in my research is dragons fly. Well, what else flies?
Yes, thank you, birds.
Birds fly,
Bats.
bats fly, that's right.
Insects.
Insects fly,
Yes, thank you, butterfly.
butterflies fly,
Flies.
flies, you're right. So all of those things fly. Well, dragons in my story are really big. So while I can use flies and bats, my dragons have a wing that looks like a bat's wing, but it's a lot bigger than a bat's wing. But it also has to take off the ground, and it has to fly in the air with the currents. So I used and researched a lot about hawks and how hawks fly and how hawks take off from the trees and swoop down. So in telling the story, I had to do a lot of research about hawks and bats and other flying things, so that when I talk about my dragons, that part of the dragon is real to you as a reader. The other thing that I had to do research on was Ireland, because my story is set in Ireland. And so in my research, I did a lot of research at home before I did anything else, but I would look at books like this, Book of Ireland, and I would sticky tag things that I thought were pretty cool, that maybe I wanted to have my dragons go to some of these places. So I would constantly read books and look at picture books and decide where I wanted my dragons to be at in Ireland. So that's part of the research that I did. The other part of the research that I did is once I started writing the story and I knew where I wanted my dragons to go and my characters to go, I actually went and took a trip to Ireland. And I visited everywhere that I wanted my dragons and my characters to go. So that's part of the research. So if you were writing something that you weren't really interested in, you wouldn't want to go and do all those things that I did, right? Because you'd be bored if you weren't interested in writing about those locations. So let me see. Oh, some of the other books that I always read about when I was little, some of my favorite books, and this will probably tell you why I like to write about dragons. Have you guys read this book, A Wrinkle in Time? This might be maybe next year for you.
Some might have already.
Have you read this book?
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit, yeah. But this talks a lot about a family with a sister who has a very special brother, and the two of them try and save the world. So it's kind of a science fiction type book. It's not necessarily set here. Not all of it is set here. But these are the types of books that I like to read. And then I found a book, an author that writes about dragons, and her name is Anne McCaffrey.